It's fairly well known that most branches of Christianity have been against most forms of magic pretty much since the get-go. But did you know that throughout much of history there have been Christians carrying out various magical practices and not seeing them as in conflict with their Christianity, especially in the later medieval period in Europe? Hi, I'm Juliet. I am a history lecturer at a British university, and this is episode 5 of my series, A History of Witchcraft and Magic in Europe. This episode is focusing on the later medieval period. This is the period when Christianity had become the dominant religion throughout most of Europe, but before the witch hunts and mass witch trials which became so infamous in the slightly later early modern period. I'm going to explore various Christian magical practices and how and why some magical practitioners were persecuted as witches, and the start of the build-up to the deadly witch trials and witch hunts of later years. The period we're looking at today is what historians usually refer to as the kind of mid to later medieval period. Early medieval is roughly about 400 or 500 up to about 1000 CE. Exactly where you place all the different borders between them will depend on exactly which country of Europe you are looking at, but basically mid to later medieval is roughly 1000 to about 1499 CE. As I say, it's going to depend which country you're focusing on usually. For example, in England we would usually put the line of demarcation between medieval and early modern in 1485, when Richard III was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth and Henry VII became the first of the Tudor kings. In other parts of Europe it might be a little bit later, maybe when Martin Luther put up his 95 Theses in the early 1500s. Or you could go for 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered the continent of America. For this video I'm going to put my cutoff point at the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum text about witches, which was published in 1486, and which played a role, how big is debated, in some of the later witch trials of the early modern period. The early modern period is what we call the bit between medieval and modern in European history. It would correspond roughly to the colonial period in American history, and is sometimes the early part called the Renaissance instead. Western Europe at this point is predominantly Roman Catholic. There's also Greek Orthodox religion being practiced in the Byzantine Empire and Orthodox Christianity in parts of Eastern Europe. Basically, the whole of Europe is by this point Christian. There is not much evidence for ongoing pagan practices, with some exceptions, like the Sami, the peoples of the very northernmost parts of Europe, who probably continued with their traditional religion a little bit longer, and of course the Muslim occupation of parts of what is now Spain and Portugal. But there is very little pagan practice going on in this period. That's not to say that earlier pagan practices and pagan magic didn't have an influence on magic in this period, because a lot of pagan traditions were absorbed by Christianity. And this is nothing new. As Christianity was developing, it was constantly taking ideas from bits and pieces of all sorts of other religions and just absorbing them into Christian practice. For example, the 25th of December, the date chosen to celebrate Jesus' birthday, is the birthday of the god Sol and is part of Mithraic religion. A lot of Christian traditions around Christmas actually come from the Roman festival of Saturnalia. And what Christians were doing is they weren't continuing to be pagan, but they were taking pagan ideas, practices, festivals, and they were making them Christian. So Christians aren't celebrating Mithraic religion on the 25th of December, but they have taken the date from Mithraic religion for their celebration of the birth of Christ. Going on into the medieval period, another example is the Green Man, a figure dressed in green clothes or green leaves whose image appeared on inn signs, and who may be related to the foliate heads that you see all across churches in some parts of Europe. Again, this is a figure with a very, very old history, because there's a face that looks like a combination of a green man and maybe an ancient Greco-Roman Gorgon at the Roman baths at Bath, what was Aquae in the Roman period. So it's obviously a motif with a very, very long history, certainly in the British Isles. The Green Man has been connected with concepts of rebirth, renewal and regeneration. He's been linked with Robin Hood, the Green Knight from the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the Egyptian god Osiris, the Greek god Dionysus. He's been considered an archetype of the unity of humanity with the natural world and all sorts of things. Ultimately, we don't know exactly why this figure appears on inn signs or this foliate head appears on churches, but it does seem to be some kind of pagan symbol from Celtic or Germanic or Roman or a mix of all three, religion, probably Celtic, that has been incorporated into Christian churches. As far as witchcraft and magic is concerned, we can see elements from earlier pagan practices that get brought in, reused, rethought, and changed into something that is not directly pagan anymore, that is practiced by Christians, but that has all these elements of earlier pagan practice that survive in it. So from Celtic magic, we get cauldrons and crystals. From Norse and Viking magic, we get the idea of wizards with staffs, of magic writing, runes especially, but magic writing in general. There's the ongoing influence of ancient Persia in astrology. There's the influence of Greece and Rome, and all their curse tablets and binding curses and voodoo dolls, not connected to actual Haitian voodoo, but basically the same idea that we saw in previous episodes. And all of these continue to have an influence on magical practices in Europe, even though the people doing them are now Christians. Now, of course, the official position of the Christian churches, of Christian theologians, particularly of the Roman Catholic Church, was very much that all magic is sinful. So it's certainly true to say that officially Christianity disapproved of any and all magical practices. This goes right back to the 4th century CE and St. Augustine in City of God, who says, "They wish to discriminate between those whom the people call magicians who practice necromancy and are addicted to illicit arts and condemned, and those others who seem to them to be worthy of praise for the practice of theurgy, or theurgy, that is divine magic calling on pagan gods or on Christian or Jewish angels, as practiced by some Neoplatonists. The truth, however, Augustine says, being that both classes are the slaves of the deceitful rites of the demons whom they invoke under the names of angels." So Augustine is very clear, all magic is wrong, all magic comes from the devil, from demons, and none of it is okay. The Canon Episcopi, a collection of church law probably originating in the 9th century, does not say sorcerers or witches should be burned, but it does instruct bishops to eject from their parishes the practitioners of the pernicious art of sorcery, who are considered to be heretics. And as we'll see later in the video, this did lead to some people being burned alive for the heretical crime of witchcraft. In official Christian thinking and theology, all magic comes from the devil, even if it doesn't seem to, and Augustine was referring to that when he mentioned demons being invoked under the names of angels. The idea is that if you think you are calling up an angel or a benign spirit, it's actually a demon in disguise. And this was often behind some official medieval theology around things like ghosts as well as angels, that souls are in heaven, hell, or purgatory, and that ghosts are demons in human form taking on the appearance of dead people. That's not necessarily the belief held by a lot of people, but it was one of the kind of theological ideas around it. And certainly the theology of magic is if you think you're calling up an angel, it's probably a demon disguised as an angel. But there is usually, in most times and places, a fairly big difference between official theology, official rules, official church doctrine, and actual practice and belief on the ground. One of the things I always used to object to in my school religious education lessons is when, teachers would describe one of the major religions of the world and say, Christians believe this, Muslims believe this, Hindu people believe this. It's like you're describing millions of people and they do not all believe the exact same things about everything. There is a core of belief that is part of being a member of that religion, especially for the Abrahamic religions. Belief is not central to every religion. It is very central to the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That's a longer conversation for another day. But anyway, the point is, outside of the core beliefs of the religion, people have all sorts of different ideas. So the fact that the church's official position was that all magic is sinful and comes from the devil does not mean that everybody on the ground believed that. Outside of the official theology of the church, the medieval conception of magic was that it came in 2 broad categories. Natural magic, which calls on hidden powers from within nature, and demonic magic, sometimes called necromancy or sorcery, which involves calling up demons. But even that division isn't as simple as that makes it sound. Some claim to be controlling the demons, in which case surely that's okay. If you call up a demon but you can control it, why would that do any harm? Some were trying to contact angels, which I'm sure they thought was totally okay. What's wrong with trying to contact an angel? Some saw themselves as similar to the ancient Roman Apuleius, who, as we saw, was put on trial for witchcraft way back in the 2nd century CE, and whose defence was, I'm not a witch, I'm a philosopher. And people in the medieval period often saw it the same way. I'm not a witch, I'm an alchemist, I'm a philosopher, I'm a scientist, I'm an astrologer. And in practice, there's evidence for people doing all the same sorts of things that we have seen them do in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in the Celtic world, in the Viking world. They're using magic for divination, to try and foretell the future or see if something's going to be good or bad for them. They're using it to identify thieves, for healing, amulets, curses. They're using wax images of people, voodoo style, to try and affect something on that person. Basically, all the things that we've been seeing in this series so far are still going on in this period. And despite the official disapproval of the church, magical practitioners are still very much around and are still doing their job in villages and towns all over Europe. I'm using the English word cunning-folk to describe them. Obviously, this word is, in English, comes from Anglo-Saxon. It comes from kunan, to know. Anglo-Saxon is also the root of Wicca, which has a different meaning and is a religion of its own in a modern context. In Anglo-Saxon, the double C was pronounced ch rather than k. So witcher, female, and witcher, male, meant witch. And then the practice of magic was drycraft. The word wizard also comes from Anglo-Saxon wis, meaning wise. Cunning-folk is a term that is often used for these kind of village magical practitioners, folk magical practitioners in England, and I'm going to use it for that type of practitioner all across Europe. Obviously, the terms would be different in different languages, but the job is basically the same. These are magic practitioners who performed healings, told fortunes, identified thieves, did love magic. We've talked before about the inappropriateness of the use of the word love, but you know what I mean, and more, all of that kind of thing. They could be male or female. They might have particular specialisms, so some might specialise in divination, some of the women might specialise in midwifery. For example, in Durham in 1446, Mariotte de Belton and Isabella Brome were accused in a Priorian convent of telling women that they could get husbands for them by magic, so love magic. In England, for most of the medieval period, if proceedings were started against cunning folk, it would usually be for moral offences dealt with by the church rather than secular offences, so they would not usually get the death penalty. Church courts in England could not give out the death penalty, they could give out lesser penalties. So unless you end up coming before a secular court for a more serious crime like murder by witchcraft or treason, and as we'll get to later, heresy, otherwise you'd be usually dealt with by the church court and it would be a less severe punishment. Of course, not everyone believed there was anything in it. Another of my constant pet peeves is the idea that everybody in the past believed in something that some people in the past believed in. It drives me crazy, honestly. It is no more true that everyone in the past believed in witches or ghosts or saints' relics or whatever than it is that everybody now is an atheist. People have different beliefs. So some people did not believe that the cunning folk had any ability. Others did. For example, in 1375, John Porter of Clerkenwell in London prosecuted John Chester for failing to find someone who had stolen some valuables. When Chester admitted to using the art of magic, the court ruled that this was the deception of the public because the magical art had no efficacy, and he must swear not to do it in future. In another London example from 1382, Robert Burwold used turning the loaf to accuse Joanna Woolsey of stealing a drinking bowl in St Mildred Poultry. This meant sticking a wooden peg in a loaf of bread with 4 knives in the sides, and then going through a list of names, and the loaf would turn at the name of the thief. Woolsey accused Burwold of maliciously lying, and he was put in the pillory with the loaf around his neck. And as you can see, again, that is one of the more low-level punishments. He's not being put to death or anything. He is being publicly humiliated and punished, and presumably told not to do it again. Some of these magical practices involved or even required Catholic priests. For example, charms for protection in childbirth were common, and often took the form of a scroll wrapped around the body of the pregnant woman supplied by priests. St Thomas Aquinas, who lived 1225 to 1274, addressed whether it is lawful to wear divine words at the neck in part of his long treatise, Summa Theologica. He concluded it is probably okay as long as it is only divine words and nothing else, and doesn't invoke demons, but he does advise caution. Divas and Pauper, a commentary and exposition on the Ten Commandments written about 1402 to 1405, surviving in several manuscripts from 15th and 16th centuries, says that some people, which presumably include the clergy, for hate or wrath that they bear against any man or woman, take away the clothes of the altar, and clothe the altar with doleful clothing, or beset the altar or the cross about with thorns, and withdraw light out of the church, or do sing mass of requiem for them that be alive, in hope that they should fare the worse and the sooner die. A mass of requiem is a mass said for the dead, to pray for the soul of somebody who has died. So this is a really quite creepy attempt to bring about somebody's death by singing a mass for their death, for their soul, when they're not dead yet. But if it involves singing a mass, then presumably it involves a priest. I suppose you could memorise the words of the mass. They are the same every time, and if you've been to a lot of requiem masses, which if you're living in the medieval period you might have done, I suppose you could have memorised the words, but it's most likely a priest who's doing that, especially as others wouldn't necessarily speak the Latin that is the language the mass is in. But you didn't necessarily need a cunning person or a priest, because we also have evidence for home remedies and everyday magical practices that anybody could carry out, or at least anybody who could read or had been told how to do it. For example, a 15th century book of household management from Wulströn Castle in the Tyrol, known as the Wulströn Handbook, has lots of instructions for household management, and it's written in German, not Latin. It's in the vernacular language, so it's obviously intended for as widespread a readership as you can get in the medieval period. So it includes advice and instructions on how to prepare leather, to make soap or ink, wash clothes, catch fish, as well as medical prescriptions for human and animal disease. And as Richard Kiekhaefer has pointed out, some of these instructions and advice include a complete mix of things we would identify separately as magic, religion and science. In the medieval period, there just isn't so much conception of those as three separate things. It's all just kind of how the world works, and it's all together in one glorious whole. Kiekhaefer gives this example from the Wulströn Handbook. It recommends taking the leaves of a particular plant as a remedy for fever of all sorts, and Kiekhaefer notes science or folk medicine. Before using these leaves, you have to write certain Latin words on them to invoke the power of the Holy Trinity, and then say the Lord's Prayer and other prayers over them. A little bit looking like magic, but you could say this is religion. It's Christian prayers, so that's Christian religion. Then you repeat this procedure before sunrise on 3 consecutive mornings. That's magic. There's nothing in Christianity. The number 3 is important, obviously. Jesus rose from the dead on the 3rd day, so presumably that's where the idea of the 3 consecutive mornings comes from. Although there's only 2 mornings involved at Easter. But anyway, you can see how it relates to Christianity, but that is a magical practice. He's doing something with no kind of basis in any obvious cause and effect in the physical world, nor even the prayer. There's nothing in the Bible that says you have to do something at sunrise 3 times. There are things in the Bible about praying a lot, about keeping asking God for something, persistence, getting you what you want. That's in the Bible. There is a parable about that, but nothing specific about 3 times at sunrise. There's also continued use of leech books, which we talked about in the previous episode. When we looked at the Viking Age, we also had a brief diversion to an Anglo-Saxon leech book. Those are still around. Sometimes people would take the consecrated hosts from the church and use them for various magical practices. So in Roman Catholicism, the host is the unleavened bread, and during the Mass, the priest does the Catholic ritual, and it is transubstantiated into the body of Christ. This is a whole Aristotelian philosophy thing. I'm not going to get into exactly the theology of transubstantiation right now, but basically the bread becomes the body of Christ. Yes, it still tastes like bread. So people would then take these, the consecrated hosts that are therefore the body of Christ, and they would use them to put out fires, to cure swine fever, to fertilise the field, and to encourage bees to make honey. And again, very fine line between magic and religion, because that's the body of Christ, which is part of religious belief. That's part of Catholic belief. On the other hand, there's nothing in Christian religion about using Christ's physical body to put out a fire. I'm sure when he was alive he wouldn't have appreciated that. People even inscribed the churches themselves with magical symbols known as witch marks. This is St Mary's Parish Church in Enville in South Staffordshire, and there are some fascinating examples of witch marks in this church. Some marks, like this star shape, might be a mason's mark or a merchant's mark, a bit like a signature for an individual professional. But if we go down the pillar, we can see here a devotional cross that people would scratch into the churches as a sort of devotional activity. On this stone here, you can see a pentagram. This is one of the more common types of witch mark. It's an unbroken line, and it was thought that demons would have to follow the line until it stopped, so they would be trapped, constantly following the unbroken line. This stone may have been moved from its original location. Right now, it is right on the high altar and right next to a medieval grave. Magical practices were also going on among the elite of society, among learned magicians and magical practitioners. Slightly more often men, primarily because men had more access to learning, same as cunning-folk might be slightly more often women because midwives are going to be women. Especially in the 12th century, royal courts often employed astrologers. Obviously, this tradition goes all the way back to ancient Persia and Persian religion, and we talked about Persian religion and astrology in the episode on ancient Rome. Astrology is usually considered related to magic and magical practices in various ways. According to the chronicler Matthew Paris, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who reigned 1215 to 1250, used astrologers to cast his children's horoscopes and to check whether his plans would succeed. He did not even consummate his marriage to the Empress Isabella until the astrologers had told him the most propitious time for doing so. That's quite extreme. As in ancient Rome, though, rulers did not like it if astrologers predicted their death. This goes all the way back to Roman emperors, Augustus, Tiberius. They were very paranoid about astrologers predicting their death, and you could get in a lot of trouble for doing so. The fear is that once an astrologer says the emperor is going to die at X time, people will feel empowered to bring that about. So they did not like it. And we will come back to this with another case study a little bit later in the video. But it wasn't just rulers who made use of astrology. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which was written between 1387 and 1400, the wife of Bath, who is a fairly wealthy weaver who has been married 5 times, says she is the way she is because of her star sign. This is the wife of Bath's tale and prologue. It is, of course, only one of the Canterbury Tales. It's just a short section from the overall Canterbury Tales. I had to study at Frey level, which is why I have the Cambridge School study guide for it. The prologue is considerably longer than the tale in this case. Chaucer seems to have been really interested in the wife of Bath as a character, far more so than maybe some of the others. The tale itself is involves Sir Gawain, if I remember right, but is much, much, much shorter than the prologue, which describes the wife of Bath, where she describes her character and her life history. I think actually in the tale she doesn't identify the knight specifically as Sir Gawain, she just says he's a knight of Arthur's court, but it's really similar to a tale about Sir Gawain from Arthurian legend. And the wife of Bath describes herself as, "For certes, I am all Venerian." That means I was born under the sign of the planet Venus, and that's where I get my character from. "I am all Venerian in feeling, and mine heart is Martian, relating to the god Mars. Venus me gave my lust, my licorousness. Venus gave me my lust and lecherousness. And Mars gave me my sturdy hardiness." Mars gave me my, hardiness. Just the toughness or endurance, says the Cambridge School Guide. So we can see from that she is using astrology. She's relatively well off. She has fairly high standing in society, but she's not an aristocrat. She's not in a royal court or anything. So astrology was something that people who could read, at least, from other parts of society were interested in as well. And of course, the medieval period gives us the practice of alchemy. Alchemy actually goes back to antiquity, and it had survived in the Byzantine Empire, in the east of Europe, and in Near Eastern Asia, and in the Arab world. So alchemy actually has a much longer history than that. But it comes to Western Europe in the later medieval period. Robert of Chester translated an alchemical treatise into Latin in 1144, which then brought it into popularity in Western Europe. Alchemists are most famous, of course, for trying to turn lead into gold and for trying to create a philosopher's stone. Richard Kiekeffer describes the theory behind it as follows. The mercury-sulfur theory viewed all metals as compounded of mercury, viewed as wet and steamy, and sulfur, thought of as dry and smoky. If these two metals are pure and are combined in optimal proportions, they produce gold. If they are impure or combined in the wrong proportions, they yield other metals such as lead. But the thinking was, by purifying these baser metals and adjusting the proportions of mercury and sulfur, the alchemist can transmute the base metals into gold, hence the attempts to turn lead into gold. Kiekefer carries on, just as the physician seeks to restore health by balancing the bodily humours. This is the theory of the four humours, which was a huge part of medieval medical practice. The four humours being blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm, and the theory being that all of them must be in harmony and in balance for the body to be healthy. If you have too much or too little of any one of them, then you have health problems. So just as the physician tries to balance the bodily humours, the alchemist transmutes metals by adjusting their qualities using a medicinal elixir as an agent of change, so that lead with its cold and dry properties is turned into gold with predominantly hot and wet qualities. The philosopher's stone was similarly an agent that could make metals into incorruptible gold, while also curing corruption or disease in human and animal bodies. So it relates to the whole lead into gold thing, but then has this kind of side effect of curing human disease, which is where the idea then comes from in Harry Potter, that it gives you eternal life. Another common learned medieval magical practice was attempts to summon angels. Now I'm trying not to think of Welcome to Night Vale as I describe this. Now, summoning angels is tricky because, as we have seen, demons might disguise themselves as angels, and demons are fallen angels in the first place in Christian mythology. So summoning angels is not without danger, but it has its roots in Jewish magic, as does the idea of angels. The word angelos is Greek and means messenger, but the concept of an angel is something that Christianity gets more from Jewish belief. And attempts to summon angels might get mixed up with folk beliefs about nature spirits, elves and fairies as well, so it's all very complicated and you have to be very careful what you're actually summoning. The prayer book of King Radzislaw, apologies for my pronunciation, III of Poland, who reigned 1434 to 44, includes insertions asking angels for help so that the king can use a crystal ball to learn about the past and future and discover his subjects' secret plans. As we saw, it's possible that crystal balls originate in Celtic magic, though the evidence isn't quite certain for that, but definitely by the later medieval period, the idea of crystal balls has come into common usage. The Book of Angels, Rings, Characters and Images of the Planets, a 15th century manuscript, has angels associated with the 7 planets recognised in medieval astronomy. Obviously, this excludes Pluto, which I will die on the hill should be a planet, and Neptune, which hadn't been discovered yet. It does include the Sun and the Moon, because of course Uranus hadn't been discovered yet either. To call upon these planetary angels, the magician makes rings, inscribes the names and magical characters of the angels on parchment or some other medium, and then offers birds or animals as sacrifices. Now that's very magic-y. In the ancient world, where animal sacrifice was a standard part of Greco-Roman religion, it was human sacrifice that then started to look a bit like witchcraft and magic. But in a Christian context, Christianity does not do animal sacrifice. Part of the theology of Christianity is that Jesus died once so that no more sacrifice is necessary. And the key parts of Catholic ritual, and indeed Orthodox, are the bread and the wine, not any kind of meat. Christians do eat meat, and of course they have fewer restrictions on the meat they eat than other Abrahamic religions do, but it's not, sacrifice of animals is not part of Christian ritual. So the sacrifice of animals, again, sort of looks a bit magic-y from a Christian perspective. And these rituals could allow the magician to travel on a black horse, win the love of a woman, create the illusion of armed soldiers or castles, turn a drink into poison, arouse enmity between two people, or destroy whatever they wanted to. I like the one about creating the illusion of castles. Actually reminds me of science fiction, where, like on Star Trek, they'll do a hologram of a ship to trick people. Anyway, I've become distracted. Carrying on. For the most part, it explains how to call upon the planetary angels by inscribing their names and conjuring them, but it also tells the reader how to conjure devils or devil kings, who are also associated with the planets. So again, there's that kind of dangerous merging of the summoning of angels and the summoning of demons. You could also summon angels as a study aid. Wish I'd known about this when I was at uni. The Ars Notoria, written in Latin in the 13th century, is a guide to help university students to improve their memory and understanding, and to master their studies using magic in the form of a set of prayers and meditative diagrams said to have been given to Solomon by an angel. The prayers ask God to grant intellectual abilities by the power of angels' names, or they ask God to send angels as aids, and even call upon the angels themselves to be present and strengthen the practitioner's capabilities. So, That's a method of revision I hadn't considered back when I was studying. If anybody wants to give it a go, let me know how it turns out. The most notorious forms of magical practice, and the ones most likely to get you prosecuted for evil witchcraft, were known as necromancy and/or sorcery. Necromancy is being used in a much broader sense than the more specific ancient sense. Technically, necromancy means raising the dead, either raising their spirit or even raising their corpse, kind of talking zombie style. And we looked at necromancy when we looked at magic in ancient Rome. But the word is now being used for a much broader range of activities, partly because of the idea that any use of magic involves calling on demons, and because of the kind of number of magical practices that do involve calling on or trying to control demons. So although necromancy technically should refer to the calling up of dead people, it gets broadened out in the way it's used to refer to demons as well, and then to all magic in some cases. And there is evidence for the practice of what we might call necromancy or sorcery for the type of magic that involves summoning demons. Basically, there is evidence that people were actually doing that. Obviously, I make no comment about their success rate, but they were trying. For example, the Munich Handbook, a manual of demonic magic now kept in the Bavarian State Library in Munich, which was written in Latin with a German appendix. So you can see that this is one of those more learned forms. You have to be able to read Latin to read this book. So this kind of goes with astrology and alchemy and summoning angels as the sort of thing that a more learned magical practitioner is going to be doing, not the sort of magic that cunning-folk or just people in their households are doing. The book gives instructions for conjuring demons with magic circles and other devices, commanding the spirits once they have appeared and compelling them to return after they have been dismissed. So the idea is that you control the demons. Nobody is trying to kind of worship them, they're trying to use them. The book says that these demons, once summoned, can be used to drive a person mad, to arouse passionate love, to gain favour at court, to create the illusion of a mighty castle. Illusory castles again, that was clearly a need in the later medieval period. There was a desperate need to make an imaginary castle. To obtain a horse that can carry the magician anywhere he wants to go. Another recurrence of that one, and of course to reveal future and secret things. So aside from illusory castles and horses, which seem to have been a very particular medieval pain point, as marketing speak would say, most of the rest of it is the same kind of stuff people have been using magic for since the dawn of time. The rituals in this book also involve elaborate paraphernalia, things like wax images of the people the magician wants to affect. Again, we've seen that before and we will again. Rings, swords, and other objects. In some cases, it requires that the magician sacrifice a hoopoe, which is a type of bird, to the evil spirits, or burn certain herbs. So we know that the church did not approve of any of this officially, even if some priests might have been involved in some of it. But what was the legal position? Obviously, this varied across Europe, and I'm not going to go into all the details of every European law across the entire period, because that would take ages. There were basically two types of legislation against magic. Secular law, which focused mainly on the harm worked by the magic, usually, and church law, which usually focused on the sinfulness of it and the offence against God. The word Maleficarum, which in Roman times had meant specifically the harm invoked by harmful magic, came to be used for all types of magic, whether they were harmful or not. Way back in the early medieval period, the English King Alfred had said magicians and witches should be put to death, but despite that, by the 12th century there was no specific law against magic in England. Most medieval trials for magic across Europe tended to be politically motivated. Again, this is all most. Usually there are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, what we're not seeing in the medieval period is these mass witch hunts and trials of large groups of people. Again, not usually, doesn't mean they didn't happen. But generally speaking, we're seeing prosecution of small numbers of people, of individuals, and a lot of them are politically motivated. Although the charge was often necromancy, in practice, cunning-folk practicing magic were vulnerable to it, either if they got caught up in some kind of political shenanigans, or sometimes even just if the people in their village took against them and decided to try and get them in trouble. For example, an inquisitor at Florence in the 1340s found that various people were saying charms over plants to use them for cures and other magic. Several people, including a widow, a monk, the rector of a church, and others had to pay fines. So that's one of those cases, again, where people aren't being put to death, but they are getting a lower level punishment for the practice of magic. Of course, some people sadly were put to death for practicing magic in this period, as well as later. You may have heard it said that witches weren't actually burned at the stake, they were hanged. That is true of witches in the early modern period, in the very famous witch trials. In the medieval period, people were actually burned alive for witchcraft. Again, not everybody. There's all sorts of variations, but there are quite a few records of people who were accused of witchcraft or of necromancy or sorcery being burned. That's because at that time, burning was a frequent punishment for heresy. Witches were not necessarily being convicted of witchcraft per se, or not only of witchcraft. Often the core crime that they had committed was heresy. Heresy is, of course, in a Christian context, things that go against Christianity. Atheism, practicing other religions, blaspheming, a lot of things could be considered heresy. And in the later medieval period, the Church and Western Europe as a whole was going through a phase of really extreme action against people they perceived to be heretics of all different stripes and from all different walks of life. It was a period of intense persecution, particularly from the Church. Of course, this is the period of the Spanish Inquisition. It's a period with a heck of a lot of anti-Semitism in England. There is a lot of persecution of anybody perceived as a heretic in this period, and often witches and practitioners of magic got caught up in that. We do also see a change from around 1300 and then especially from the early to mid 1400s, and we can see the beginnings of the later witch trials that would be so infamous. We see the beginnings of the idea of the witch's Sabbath starting to appear in the 1400s. Between 1435 and 1437, Johannes Nieder, a Dominican theologian, wrote a theological treatise called Formicarius, which means the ant heap. It is in the form of a dialogue between a theologian and a lazy student. I think I've been at least one, if not both of those. In Book 5, Nieder describes the alleged activities of a new sect of heretics. So note, this is coming from this persecution of people perceived to be heretics, known as Malefici, or witches, who combined the performance of harmful magic with ceremonies at which they allegedly rejected their Christian faith and performed various horrific acts. So all of these things are coming together. The idea that magic relates somehow to contact with demons, which becomes over time the idea that it involves worshipping demons or the devil. The persecution, intense persecution of anybody perceived to be a heretic, and then kind of other things coming into that as well, the use of the word maleficium and malefici and changing ideas about witches, and it all comes together to slowly create the picture that would become the basis for the persecutions and the witch trials in the early modern period. The 1400s also gives us the earliest image we have of witches riding broomsticks. These pictures of two witches riding broomsticks come from the Champion des Dames by Martin de France, who lived 1410 to 1461. And this is the first record we have of this idea, that witches fly on magical flying broomsticks to get to their meetings. If we have a look at a case study from England from the mid-1400s, we can also see how what you were charged with and how you were punished could also depend on your status in society, as well as the type of magic you were thought to be performing. In 1441, Roger Bolingbroke, a priest from Oxford, confessed to conspiring with several others to assassinate the king, Henry VI, who was then 19 years old, using magic. The others accused with him, or the others that he implicated, were Thomas Southwell, Canon of St Stephen's in Westminster, John Home, Canon of Hereford and St Asaph, Marjorie Jourdamain, known locally as the Witch of Eye, who was presumably a cunning woman and who had already been charged with sorcery in 1432, and Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess of Gloucester, wife of Duke Humphrey and the king's aunt. The whole thing may have been motivated by Duke Humphrey's enemies at court. Bolingbroke, Southwell and the Duchess, as an accomplice, were indicted for sorcery, felony and treason. Bolingbroke, Southwell and Home were accused of using magical figures, vestments and instruments and invoking demons and evil spirits to anticipate when Henry VI would die. And there it is again. The Roman emperors were worried about it. Henry VI is worried about it. The idea that it is dangerous to suggest that you know when the king will die and that it's because you are planning to bring it about yourself. Southwell was accused of having a book of necromancers' oaths and experiments in hand, standing and chanting protective masses. It was claimed that they had made a figurine of the king to work on and had calculated that he would die of melancholia at the end of May or early in June 1441. Eleanor, the Duchess, was said to have encouraged them in all this and promised them gifts in return. Marjorie Jourdamain confessed that Eleanor had employed her as a sorceress, primarily to concoct medicines and potions to induce Duke Humphrey to love and marry her. So we don't know whether or not that's true. She may have been tortured. On the other hand, she does appear to have been a known cunning woman, and that is the sort of magic that cunning folk generally practiced, so that could be true. Southwell died in the Tower of London on the 26th of October. Marjorie Jourdamain recanted but was burned alive, presumably for heresy, and in her case it's thought to be particularly severe because she has been convicted before, she has had a lesser punishment, but she's then relapsed. But the reason she's burned is because the crime is heresy, and also because she's of a lower social status. You are more likely to be burned if you are lower social status, at least in this period. There have also been very well-known elite people burned at the stake for heresy, certainly on into the reign of Queen Mary, that is the case. Eleanor was forcibly divorced from Duke Humphrey and made to walk through the streets carrying a burning taper on 3 market days as a public penance. I've got a couple of images here, neither quite completely accurate. She was bareheaded, on foot, dressed in black and carrying a wax taper. So these images have her bare foot. One of them has her bareheaded, but then like with a white sheet. She was dressed in clothes. They were black. Just walking on foot for her high status is fairly humiliating. She may have been barefoot, but bareheaded because in this period a respectable married woman would be wearing some kind of head covering. So it's designed to humiliate her. John Home was pardoned, but Bolingbroke was convicted of practicing sorcery by an ecclesiastical court in London. Then he was publicly exhibited with his magical paraphernalia, including images of wax and silver at St Paul's Cross, but then he was hanged, drawn and quartered, and presumably that last one is treason. That's a standard punishment for treason. So he's been hanged, drawn and quartered for the crime of treason against the king. And throughout the 1300s and 1400s, we do then start to see the type of witch trial that would become sadly so common in some places later on. An early example is the trial of Alice Kittler, not sure how to pronounce that name, and others in 1324. Although oddly not often in Ireland. Ireland had, I think, one other witch trial. They're very rare in Ireland, but in other parts of Europe this type of thing would become more common. In 1324, 12 people, including Alice, were accused of being heretic sorcerers. Dame Alice herself was accused of sacrificing animals to a demon, having relations with an incubus demon, and using powders, ointments and lotions to commit murder and persuade young men whom she had infatuated by magical means to give their possessions to her. Some of the 12 were absolved after doing a penance, like Eleanor. Some, including Dame Alice, escaped to England, but one woman, Petronilla of Meath, was burned at the stake for heresy. So again, the punishment is burning because the crime is heresy. The stereotype of the satanic witch and the start of the later European witch trials is often then located in either the Alps or the Pyrenees, the 2 major mountain ranges of Europe. In the Aisne Valley in the Pyrenees in 1424, so 100 years after Dame Alice's trial, several people were accused of going by night with witches. This is from the Catalan word bruxa. I'm really sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. It eventually becomes the Spanish bruja. In the medieval period, this is a figure derived from the Roman lamia and strix, and I'll do a whole separate video on the Roman lamia because that's a whole nother topic for another time, and how that then gets wrapped into medieval witch belief is a long and complicated story. But they were accused of going out by night with witches and worshipping the devil, kidnapping and murdering sleeping children, and poisoning adults and killing them with maleficia. The nobles of the area and the court set out a new set of crimes and punishments for witchcraft, including permitting torture to get a confession and burning as a punishment. So we can see here what would become that spate over a couple of centuries in Europe of witch trials and witch hunts that's sometimes called a witch craze. I'm going to be looking at the early modern period in the next 2 episodes of this series. So I put out episodes in this series, History of Witchcraft and Magic in Europe, roughly every 4 weeks. What I'm going to do with the early modern period is I'm going to do first an episode on magic and witchcraft and magical practices in the early modern period in general, so that we can really take time to look at all the various magical practices that were going on. And then we'll have an episode dedicated specifically to the witch trials, because they are such an important part of the history of witchcraft and magic in that period. So I want to give them an entire episode to themselves and not like rush them at the end of another video. And I will do something on the Lamia and the Strix as well at some point over the next few weeks. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and let me know in the comments if you would be interested in videos looking into any particular witch trial in more detail. I know there's a few witch trials I've talked about in videos, like the Pendle witches, Eleanor Cobham, Dame Alice. There's plenty of witch trials, sadly, in European history, and I will do one on Salem at some point. Yeah, if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know in the comments. And of course, I'm always happy to talk about my favourite Roman, Apuleius, although I did do his trial in quite a bit of detail in episode 2. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye! You the goodest girl. The goodest girl. The bestest pup.